tout le monde. Étant donné qu'on a la moitié des panélistes en anglais, ça va être l'étendue du français que vous allez entendre pour la prochaine heure. So, hi everyone. Maybe just a quick roundtable, starting with you, Krista, on who you are, and then we'll move on to questions.
Hello, hi, I'm Krista Broughton, Open Banking Lead, Mastercard Canada.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning. My name is Patrick Raimondi. I'm a managing director at Accenture, working in their banking strategy practice.
Hi, good morning. My name is Peter Hazlehurst. I'm co-founder and CEO of a company called Synctera.
Hi everyone, I'm Yves-Gabriel Leboeuf, co-founder and CEO of Flinks.
So maybe before we start going into a bit deeper, I was looking at the stat, 18% of Canadians know what open banking is. I would hope that in this room it's a bit higher, but still I would like to just put the question out of what open banking is, maybe starting with you, Pat.
Sure. So open banking is a concept that has been discussed globally and has been implemented globally in many jurisdictions. Fundamentally, it's about a common way, structured way to be able to share banking consumer information across different institutions. Today, a lot of the information, financial institution resides in large financial institutions and banks, and the ability to open it in a secured fashion, which is a big differentiator from an open banking standpoint, with consent from the customers to be able to understand, manage their data, their privacy, and control their information are some of the big pillars of open banking.
Thank you. Anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, so I used to work at a company called Yodlee, and we did a lot of this stuff starting in like 99, 2000. And I think for me, open banking is about the recognition that it's not actually the bank's data, it's the consumer's data. And they are giving permission for the bank to share their information with others, but it's actually theirs. And if we can reconcile that sort of delta between thinking that the bank has proprietary control over their information, we actually unlock a whole bunch of behavior and new use cases.
And what you just said is interesting, and I would like to come back to it a bit later in terms of who owns that data, because historically, financial institutions thought they were the owners of that data. And we've seen the pushback at the beginning. But before we go there, what's the state of open banking in Canada? And maybe I'll go with you, YG.
That's a very good question. If Abraham's in the room, we could ask him the question, perhaps. But but I think it's for now. If we had to define the state of open banking, probably that we would talk about like some sort of market-driven approach to accessing financial data, only because it's the only thing we have right now, right? I think we hope eventually to have a proper system in place where we can remove, by example, systemic risk from a technological standpoint by improving access to data through APIs and so on. But as of right now, I think the state is a bit of an archaic one built by in-market solutions.
And you know, when we think about open banking elsewhere, because we want to adopt it in Canada, hopefully we will, what benefit did it bring elsewhere in the world? So Peter, you're from the US. Mm-hmm. What have you seen down there that should allow us or should push us toward open banking?
So I think the US is not much more advanced than Canada in terms of enablement. There are no public APIs, there's no specifications. I think the one area that some of the bigger banks have pushed for, and then we've pushed in place in general, is credentialing or the user experience being driven by open authentication. So no longer do you put in a username and password on some random form controlled by some fintech. You actually get a screen from Chase or Bank of America that's really theirs. And so the trust has boomed a little bit in that respect. I think in the US, Plaid and others have done a really good job of getting lots of user growth, but I don't think the consumer actually understands what's going on.
In terms of consumer understanding, it's interesting because I think right now in Canada, 2/3 of Canadians have linked their accounts to perform some kind of financial arrangement or opportunity. And so the word open banking, the nomenclature may not resonate, but the actions and what the want is there certainly. Now, in terms of open banking and where we sit in Canada and where the opportunity is globally, there's over 60 countries that are engaged in open banking right now. And the impetus, regardless if it's government-led or market-led, is still the same. It's to stimulate competition, drive innovation, find efficiencies, and deliver value across the value chain, to your point, to the benefit of the consumer. And then when we think about Canada, there's still some ways to go. However, momentum is gaining, and I expect to see some significant activity in the near future with the forerunners jumping ahead, filling in the gaps, defining and shaping the market as we move.
Because definitely what we've seen in Canada is that open banking is going forward. Mm-hmm. Regulation or not, like, I think the ecosystem has been moving. Do you think that in open banking we can manage to make everybody winners? Or is there obligatory going to be a losers, either fintechs, banks, or consumers?
I do think that there's room for every player to win in open banking. There has to be a structure in which that happens. And part of it, and we've seen it in other jurisdictions, is the consultory nature of being able to shape a framework for which all of the different parties are involved in an equal fashion. And so being able, having leaders in the industries, fintech players, agencies, be involved in the framework with an equal weight will help drive a common benefit. I think the other factor that will help create that is having, and we've seen it in the UK with OBI, having an independent body being able to certificate, regulate, and enforce on behalf of the industry, but not having necessarily a particular stakeholder driving the agenda for open banking would be the two things that I would share.
Krista, anything to add?
In terms of winners and losers, I subscribe to the Simon Sinek view. So for those of you who may be familiar, in this world, I don't believe the pie is shrinking or the pie is static. I think the pie is growing. Mastercard recently put out a report on the future of payments, and they cited that the open banking market will grow to $116 billion in 2026. There is opportunity to be had. It's not just one game. The playing field is ever expanding. The goalposts are moving out. There's multiple players that will enter in at any point in time. And the very purpose of the game is to perpetuate the game. For those players that enter in, whether it's now or they're observing and finding the right place and right time, I think the opportunity will be had. So I don't know if winners and losers is the right way to think about the opportunity.
Interesting. And turning to Peter and YG, open banking right now is based heavily on collaboration with banks on the fintech side. What could bank do more to support fintechs and Canada into adopting open banking?
So I think, YG, you'll have a better perspective on the Canadian banks. But in general, the banks, if they could agree to actually conceptually want to share the information, that will make things a lot easier for everybody. Then it's just mechanisms. Then it's technology. Yeah. There's still a lot of friction in the marketplace around should the consumer be able to see what their balance is or see their last transactions. And that's the very early stages. In Europe, you've got advanced functionality, including payment orchestration and execution, which is fantastic. And so at Uber, we took advantage of a lot of that functionality to create better experiences for our customers. And I think what's the challenge in the market is mind share. Like, do you fundamentally believe that consumers should be able to see their information? If yes, then let's go. And all of this stuff is old school. This stuff has been, like, some of the connectors were introduced by Microsoft and Quicken in the 90s. This is not new technology. So positioning that the consumer has rights and then allowing that to then extend to how the bank surface area is extended into the fintech is really important, as long as you can keep it safe and secure.
RG?
We work with about 50% of the top 20 banks in Canada, so we have quite interesting perspective on how they see through open banking and their vision of where it's going. And I just want to go back to your questions, your question right before about the winners or the potential winners and losers. And I think in both cases, or at least my view is that if we have a better open banking system in Canada, consumers will be the winners. If we don't, consumers will be the losers. I think sharing your data is key for innovation, and consumers will keep sharing their data because they need to share it. They need to share it for applying to a mortgage, because they're changing job and they have to share their bank account number. We need to share data all the time. The how is what we altogether control, and what national bank, of course, national bank control it, but what financial institutions control, and that's what I think we have to focus on. And back to the point of, I guess, the Canadian landscape, we see more and more institutions that are moving toward internally built solution that is much better than the existing solutions. And National Bank is actually a great example, launching the first open banking platform in Canada, so you can access your financial data through a OAuth connection.
But is data sharing enough? Because we're all speaking about data sharing, but shouldn't open banking bring us further?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I just be able to do transaction from one account through all my banks?
It's not enough, but we're so behind Canada that it's a first start. That's my view.
It's a starting point. If you think of open banking as the beginning step of a journey where some financial information is shared, we talked about the read and the right and the ability to transact. It is a starting point. We're starting to see, however, that in certain geographies like Brazil or Mexico that are already moving more to an open finance concept, which is to bring additional data, additional transactional information payments, creates a lot richer set of data to be able to use, more complex use cases, and creates more of an interesting value proposition at the end of the day for the consumer. But I agree with you, YG, that fundamentally in order to be successful, and that's another learning from other geographies, is focused and a bit of a stepped approach to be able to gather the structure required to be able to move forward.
So, yeah, Krista, please.
If I may, if you think about open banking, it's simply a capability. So in its base form, it's not enough. Likely it needs to be applied to the right use case. We've got a few hunches here in Canada as where the starting points might be. Then if you think about data and open banking sits next to that is AI. Beyond that, we belong in Mastercard in the payments world. We see other capabilities such as real-time rail, tokenization, borderless rails. When you start combining those capabilities and put them next to use cases, that's when it becomes more powerful. But for open banking to really happen, then you need players. You need people participating. So, and ergo, cycle begins again.
So that's funny, because you need player to play. Do you believe that players in Canada are not open to play enough yet? Are we too reluctant in Canada to go into that tangent?
I don't think so. I mean, there's a few. We're moving in open banking in a bit of a multi-speed world, I think. You talked about it today. It's market-driven. Regulation should come and will help provide that structure. At the same time, we're a country where we're digitally enabled already and relatively mature as consumers. And the notion of sharing information differently, screen scraping, whatever, is not new. And so I think potentially there is already an openness and a market for open banking. I think the trick will be to consolidate these different capabilities and be able to do it in a structured manner that's going to be safe, that's going to be able to scale, bring security, and a lot of consumer awareness to be able to really take advantage of it.
So before we move more into security, we've talked a lot about retail users. Is there any use cases for business users? And Peter, maybe I'll go to you for that.
Yeah, I mean, so just as much, if not more so, particularly when you think of the businesses extending to multi-parties. And so as a business owner, I want to know, will my customer pay me? And in order to do that, it would be great to be able to see their books and understand their economics and, oh, wow, they're in trouble. And maybe I can offer them a loan too, to cover their purchase of a new restaurant equipment or something like that. So the business use case in many ways is much more valuable than the consumer use case because of the exposure to multiple generations of users downstream. The consumer ultimately has to be comfortable sharing their information. And when I say the consumer in that case, it could be the business owner sharing the business's concept and data in upstream and around. But yeah, business is just as interesting, if not more so.
Krista, on Mastercard, see anything in business?
Yes, actually tons. Especially we have a sweet spot and we're very focused on small business. And from that perspective, there's a lot of benefit of open banking. Small business owners right now are often challenged in terms of gaining access to credit, capital, have a hard time managing the ins and outs of their business, health of their business, cash flow, setting up their business even. My husband had to use our personal finances to set up their business. It's not ideal. If you think about the opportunities in open banking from understanding the data that passes through, to your point, there's a lot. Then you sit next to that, the penchant and the propensity for small business owners to be, they're quite digitally inclined. Chances are they're already using a fintech provider, maybe accounting software, so there's some habits there that have been understood. They're quite loyal customers, are very engaged with their primary banks. All of this equates to a very ripe opportunity to be able to work and provide benefit to the business customer.
Pat, YG, anything?
I mean, I do agree that from a value delivery standpoint, there's a case around businesses in Canada. I think, though, that from a volume standpoint, there's much more consumers that will be using open banking than there is businesses. It's just normal if you compare the millions of Canadians versus I don't know how many businesses there is in Canada, probably 500,000, something like that. So I think if we had to focus on something in Canada, I think it should be consumer to start with.
Pat?
I think I agree with you from a volume standpoint. I think the SMB business angle is very interesting. From a commercial standpoint, maybe a little bit more. We talked about a few use cases, but the equivalent of PFM, but BFM for their ability to view their overall financial perspective, access to credit, and alternative sources of credit, which is not always easy for small businesses, mainly is a big use case. More advanced use cases would be on the accounting front, right? And if you think of the purpose of a business and having multiple providers, the ability to onboard a new client in a much faster way, in a much more seamless way, has tremendous financial value, I think, from a business standpoint.
And to be honest, I wanted to spend some time on business today with you guys because it's an area we tend to forget when we talk about open banking. And I think the use cases to help entrepreneurs manage their business more efficiently and go faster is really there in open banking. Now, with all of what we just discussed, come the question, what about security? As a user, am I losing control over my data? Or actually, are we increasing my control over my own data? And maybe starting with YG?
I think it's a win-win-win. If we structure the system, you'll for sure be able to better control where your data is going, who had access to it, and then revoke access to it. I don't see a case where open banking would actually decrease the control that we have as consumers over the data. And that's one of the big question mark I have as to why we don't have it yet, why financial institutions in Canada have not published API yet. From a systemic risk standpoint, it's just a no-brainer to have APIs and stop the credential sharing. That should have been done years ago.
Pat, I'm seeing you agree.
In theory, one of the key pillars of open banking is the ability to share data in a much more secured fashion. And if done properly, a lot of the control of that information comes back to the hands of the end user, the end customer. And that's the whole purpose. In order for that to happen, there has to be clear rules around consent management, transparency on how also where is the information. And so the notion of transparency, the notion of consent is critical to understanding where the data flows, but also the security around the data flows, which is also a key pillar on that.
From a Mastercard perspective, I agree on all fronts, and we see right now terabytes of data passing through the financial ecosystem at every fraction of a second, and our role is to instill confidence across all parties. And so, hence, as we think about open banking, this is it's very core to how we see the world play out. And so, although to reconcile the views of customer control, yes, customers own it, they control it, they can move it, they benefit from it, but it has to be grounded in the understanding that it's secure and it's safe. And so in early days, layers there might look like the use cases, the movement of data is bespoke to use case. The credentials are limited for each use case. There's tokenization layered on top. Where it gets really interesting is in the future world of open banking. And so it's good to think about setting us up on the right stage, right foot forward at the beginning. Because as the ecosystem gets more frothy, you have bad actors entering in, there needs to be governance, ethics, controls. Cybersecurity is a really significant theme here. And to shed some light on this, I think I heard a stat during the pandemic, or since the pandemic, there has been a 600% increase in cyber fraud, bad actors relaying data to the tune of $6 trillion cost to the economy. Which is quite significant. So certainly things to be thinking about and getting us started on the right page.
And that's interesting. And I want to hear each of you on the next question. Let's have a bit of fun. Let's get the crystal ball out. What's the future outlook of open banking, and where can it bring us? What kinds of business opportunity does it generate for the actors in the economy? Maybe starting with you, Peter.
So I think, so at Synctera, our job is to help people build banking applications and experiences for other sorts of businesses. And a big part of that is sharing my information so that I can get better underwriting on a loan or access to credit and so forth, or being able to predict when my paycheck is being deposited and so forth. So I think from the consumer's perspective, I'll be slightly controversial. I don't think they think about open banking at all in any way, shape or form. No different than no consumer understands what ISO 8583 is. But it works, and when I use an ATM machine, I can see my balance. It needs to be standardized in a way that the user, it's completely transparent and they trust in it. But teaching them to trust in it is a little bit like accepting cookies on the browser. Do any of you read the terms and conditions on all the stupid cookie annoyances? I don't. I sort of say, oh, I kind of like this website. Yes. This website's crap. No. But it's totally judgment driven. Where the future goes is where it's so transparent and so inherent that you can just walk up to any device, whether it's an ATM or a website, an experience, and you can get access to the information you need to do what you're doing. The credential of what you do to authenticate yourself in an ATM is a card or a tap and pay. And on the web, we don't really have that equivalent experience because we don't have portable card readers, notwithstanding American Express trying to launch one with Blue. And so what's our alternative? Let the bank tell us who we say we are, log into them, get the information from them? Maybe. But where it goes is, because it's so ubiquitous and so natural, the consumer doesn't think about it anymore, and they trust the ecosystem. But to trust the ecosystem, you need someone to set the rules, and then some organization to enforce the rules.
Pat, what do you guys see in consulting in terms of future business?
From a consulting standpoint, there's a lot to do on open banking, from the incumbent banks to be able to open their network and to be able to share the information, and more partnership with the fintech and the third-party providers. When I think of the future of open banking, what I aspire to for us in Canada would be, on one side, we have one of probably the most solid, structured financial industry in the world. Very secured, very stable. We've seen other markets behave very differently than how our Canadian financial structure has operated. That has to continue. And so while that stability and that structure is critical to the economy of Canada and all of the consumer, we haven't seen, we were talking about it a little bit before, we haven't seen as much innovation in the world of financial services that maybe other jurisdictions have seen, or the potential for consumers to be able to see more. And that would be one of the aspiration of the benefits, and we've seen it in the more mature markets like the UK, the development of a lot more innovation, which in the end would benefit, the end customers, whether it's the consumers or businesses.
I can share a little anecdote about, you're talking about the future of in Canada, but what we're seeing in other jurisdictions. So in the States, what's happening right now, in the last 5 years, those players that have taken the top spots in loan origination are the ones that have embraced digital, embraced open banking to a certain extent. Guaranteed Rate, for example, is one of our partners down there. Over half of their customers use the digital flow and digital flow only, which gives time back to the loan officers to support the customers with the higher need use cases. We also partner with a company called Tomo Credit in the States, and they have a really interesting story. It was founded by a woman who couldn't get a loan, an auto loan in the States. She has found a sweet spot in that 20% of U.S. customers have a hard time accessing a loan, might be cash rich. And so to that end, simply by linking accounts using open banking data, not requiring a credit check, she's built an entire business model around it, and it's doing very, very well. So there's some near-term opportunities that could be had right here in Canada, future as well, but won't go there now.
Waji?
I think some of the big innovation pillar that open banking could bring to Canada are pretty simple, and I think that TD and RBC are probably going to stay the two biggest financial institutions in Canada for the next 100 years, and that's fine. And I know we like to brag about the fact that we have one of the most stable financial system in the world, and that consumer can benefit from it. But some innovation that I do see happening is, by example, stop charging NSF fees to Canadian consumers when there's actually no associated fees in managing an NSF. Like, think about like a small family that, I don't know, didn't have enough funds in their account and get 3 NSF fee in a day. That's $120 just right there. Like, this has to stop. And this, I think, can be powered by open banking with a small increase in competition. But I think from some from some standpoint, we're archaic in Canada, and that's really what I hope will change.
No links with archaic, but is the regulator following enough the parade? We've talked a lot about having similar standard. Do we believe that the regulator is following up, and do we believe they're doing enough to regulate the area?
I think they're looking at it enough right now, but everything is kind of holding their breath and looking at what will be delivered. We at Flinks would like to see kind of a mixed government-led, market-led approach to open banking in Canada, not entirely market-driven. So that's what we hope we'll see in Canada.
Peter, in the U.S.?
In the US, there's a little bit of work being done by CFPB and others on increasing trust and the desire to set up standards. But just like here in Canada, excuse me, the big banks are basically saying, we'll do it when we're ready. And there's no impetus, there's no tipping point, there's no date. And it's a little bit like the EMV switchover in the US with tap and pay. And like, we started having those conversations in 2009, 2010. And then there were mandates, and there was this opportunity to share risk with the merchant and all of that stuff. And most of the big merchants just said, we don't care. And until it was, ironically, the pandemic that encouraged user behavior to say, I don't want to touch a device, did we actually get tap and pay deployed? And we need to find that sort of tipping point in open banking in the same fashion.
Yeah, because I was going to say, if we're waiting for the big banks, we're going to wait a long time.
Correct.
Pat?
Maybe an additional position would be, from a regulatory standpoint, I think there has to be some innovation and some flexibility to create the space to drive that collaboration, that innovation. It also has to be anchored on strong existing laws or regulations. So if you think of Australia, that has anchored a lot of its open banking around the consumer data protection, but to be able to anchor on stuff that already exists today that can be leveraged as opposed to just reinventing the wheel, will help us and will also drive adoption, I believe.
Krista, one last word?
I think, you know, we are moving forward. I think there's been a lot of conversation in Canada, being a country that sits right close to the States with across the pond, UK, EU, a lot of activity happening. We can see the benefits. We can see best practices. I firmly believe that regulation will come and the constituents will act in accordance with what is to come. But there's been a lot that's been fleshed out over the last near term to have an understanding and coalescence around certain guidelines that I do feel like, as I started out by saying, the forerunners will jump in. I think we're going to see some activity and they'll fill in the gaps, define the playing field. And so to my friend's point over here, it will be somewhat regulatory, somewhat market driven at the end.
Thank you. And maybe now we'll open the floor for a question from the audience. We've tried to cover everything. We've probably missed something, so now it's the time for you to get the information you wanted. Over there. I don't know who's got the microphone. I don't know where it is.
Okay. Hi, my name is Matsu. And my question to all of you is, how do you see open banking impact the fight against money laundering?
So the question was, how is open banking going to impact on anti-money laundering fight? Don't know if anybody wants to take that question first.
Open banking data in early days, we can offer partial KYC, not necessarily AML. And so I think we're moving towards that to a certain extent, being able to validate who you are. I think there will be more to unfold as the movement moves forward out of the KYC world into the AML world, but it's one certainly that there would be opportunity.
I believe there's a certification process to get access to open banking as well. That will also help. Standardization across the APIs, formal structure will help. Certification of the different bodies and the enforcement of that certification will also be a driver to help reduce fraud or anti-money laundering.
And in general, when we're talking about anti-money laundering and fraud, the more data you have, the better you'll be able to fight those. So the more we can exchange, so the banks already exchange a lot of information, but if we start opening this up to a lot of other actors in the economy, you'll be able to catch AML way easier, in my view, than in the current system we have. Another question from the public? Oh, just right there.
Hi, cybersecurity guy here, so you'll have to pardon me for the cybersecurity question. Let's say we magically solve authentication. Are we there? Are we out of the woods yet? I mean, I see a lot of things going to the legal side, to the question of data ownership and the likes, but cybersecurity-wise, let's say we secure the system and we get authentication out of the way. Are we good with open banking?
I think it's just the start. So authentication is the preeminent sort of process of ensuring that my username and password doesn't get shared unnecessarily or at all with anybody else. But then the next sort of phase would arguably be some sort of tokenization so that my account number isn't being shared and it's effectively anonymized on the network. And then you're looking at extra controls around, can you remove your data from somewhere else and be sure that it's going to happen? The last step is by far the hardest. And the only way that's going to happen is some sort of regulatory penalties for when you get it wrong and when people actually lose your data and get in trouble with it. And we saw this in the US with data breach notifications and sort of thing that have then sort of progressively gone across the globe. And so I think the challenge for cybersecurity is the most basic building block is login. Then you've got like anonymization in the providers. And then you have fundamental safety. Do you trust where did my data land and did it get kept safely?
Any other questions? Over there.
Do you see open banking playing a role with cryptocurrencies?
Anybody
ahead,
wants
Phil.
to take this one? Yeah, no, I'm the moderator. I can answer the question, but YG, you just volunteered yourself, so go ahead.
Come on. I mean, potentially. I think every step toward better digitalization of finance can be a step toward cryptocurrency use cases, but potentially.
And to be honest, on crypto, it's really going to depend what you're looking at. Cryptocurrency now bunch a bunch of things together. You can have a Canadian crypto made by the Bank of Canada that would definitely benefit from open banking. If we're talking about Bitcoin and so on, becomes maybe a bit more difficult. Any other questions?
Up at the back.
So we've talked about open banking and how that makes data more available and more prevalent at the center of what we do. Another big topic, and I'm going to drop the word, AI, Gen AI, for those who were in the previous session, is also about using that data and transforming that data to actually make it more available and more use cases. So what use cases do you see at the intersection of open banking and AI or Gen AI?
I think one of the low-hanging fruit is credit underwriting. So right now, by example, when you apply for a mortgage, it's a very traditional process, entirely or mostly built out of the credit file. Whereas if you think of newcomers to Canada, which could have been in Canada for 18 months, with a stable employment income and so on, that don't necessarily have credit card, cell phone, that will eventually populate their credit file. This is an example where I think AI or even like basic engineering, like machine learning can really help credit adjudication, which I think is a bit unused in prime credit right now, in the prime credit space, but is getting more popular in the near prime and subprime space.
I mean, generally, if you think of one of the key advantage of open banking is the ability to process more data, right? And to have access to more information. And so how you turn that information into insights or value proposition is the analytics capability. And so Gen AI just enables you to, propel that analytical capability to a different level. But generally, so credit, I agree with you, YG. Generally, a higher level of sophistication around personalization. If you think of whether it's the incumbent banks or the fintechs, but what would be a new service offer, value proposition? How can you be more relevant because you have a much better understanding of your customers? That's where the intersection of the two, I think, can be very, very powerful.
And when we talk about open banking, we only talk about open banking intra-country. Canada would benefit from extra-country as well. So opening banking data with other countries. We are one of the major land of immigration right now on Earth. Mm-hmm. And it would be way easier if we were communicating a lot with the banks in other countries so that someone from India coming in, I could have access to his account and so on back in India and go back to lending, allow him to access lending way quicker in Canada. So yes, we've talked about intra-Canada, but we will need to talk about extraterritorial open banking at some point, I believe.
Can I just ask?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So you said more data. I just want to go back to that because in my view, open banking doesn't necessarily mean more data. It means better controlled data because, again, you have to compare it with what we have today, right? If we look at the US and Plaid that had a class action lawsuit, I think, a couple of years ago, where they were accessing more data than consented by the consumer. This is an example, again, that open banking would solve. If you're allowing a company to access your account number, they will only access your account number. You don't have to share, by example, your bank statement manually, where they would see a lot of very confidential information. You share the only thing you have and want to share.
In banking in general, we've been using machine learning for a very, very long time, particularly around predicting fraud, particularly around decisions around who should get credit and who shouldn't get credit. So I don't think that's new. Where AI gets really interesting is it transforms the Q&A from being data science driven, so an engineer sitting there saying, I anticipate this question, therefore I'm going to create a model to solve it, to more open-ended, should I do this? What do you think? What's my choices? We've done this in personal finance for a very long time of saying, should I spend today? Or do I have enough money to cover this bill? But what we always had to do was pre-can the questions. What's nice about Gen AI is the interpretation of the question can be dynamic, and it can read into the data in different and interesting ways. The challenge for that is you don't always know why it made a decision. And the problem with banking is if you can't prove why did this person get a loan versus that person, you're in trouble with most regulations.
Agreed.
We've
Krista?
talked about the use cases and the opportunities, and being it underwriting or personalization or spend management. I think looking at the back end to the earlier points on cybersecurity, there's a huge wealth of opportunity there. Mastercard is incubating many AI solutions right now. Over the last 3 years, we've curbed costs due to cyber crime to the tune of 35 billion right now. And so there's a wealth of opportunities, the number of actors that playing, the number of data that's available. That's another interesting area to think about.
Very good question. Brought the attention of everyone. Thank you. There's 1 minute left, so one last very quick question. Just David in the back.
And there was the guy over there.
I've actually got a microphone here already.
There you go.
Preemptive strike.
Sorry, I get the last question because I've already got the microphone. So I know this panel is about beyond reading data, but I think the elephant in the room is we spent a whole bunch of time and effort on, what Abraham did in particular, on building a report about open banking. But my understanding, it's gone nowhere. So what do we have to do to get out of our own way in Canada and just do the reading of data for open banking?
Anyone wants to take that question?
I'm not Canadian, I'm passing.
It's a very difficult question, to be honest. I don't know if anyone has a view. I think my view is that we need to move forward with that report. We need to implement it. Do we have the political willingness to do it? That's the question that is open right now. But what I can tell you is everybody on this board are moving forward with open banking. We're not waiting for the people to come out. We're doing it today.
Look, if the Europeans can get Apple to add USB-C, surely your regulators can get open banking going.
I'm sure they're able to do it. Time is up. Thank you very much, everyone.